Alright, well, welcome back to the chess project, part 8. In this tutorial, we're going to cover how to do some digital sculpting with the knight here. So I have the knight here and I actually subdivided already. I added some divisions by clicking the Model Toolkit and clicking on the Add Divisions button. And that will add some division for sculpting. And I could actually add one more. So I'm just going to click on that and you can see here it updated. So it's got another division there. So now it's got some better sculpting detail areas to sculpt with. I also created this eye, and it's basically just a sphere. It has a little extrusion on the little bit there. And if I go to my channel box here and just type in a 0 here, I can bring it back into the socket of like the horse here. And I put it on its own layer so I can reference it. And now it won't actually be selectable. So I can basically sculpt around it. So with this object selected here, I can go to the sculpting shelf up here and then double click on the first tool here. And I have some settings already set up here. I have the size, the strength to 0.035. The strength can be really strong, especially with a stylus. I'm working with Cintiq. So it's got a pretty strong stylus. And then you want to add symmetry. So in here, this is typically set to off. And if I hit Object X, basically it will provide symmetry to this object here. If I select it with the Move tool here, you can see that this arrow here is the X-axis. If I move this over, you can see my little widget down here. But that's the X-axis. So that is basically where you want everything to go into play. Another thing that's important, because we're going to use this geometry for another program, if we tap spacebar, I want you to note that it's centered on the grid. It's very important that it's centered on the grid. So if this was off in here, so let me zoom in here and I'll tap spacebar in here. If I had this moved over like this, what I could do is hold the X key and basically it would snap to the center there just by dragging over. So and that just makes sure it's centered, and it's important for the symmetry action to work that way too. So basically at this point I can now I can close out this window and double click on my Sculpt tool again, or just click once on it, and with that tool selected I can start sculpting. So basically I can change my brush size by hitting the B key, and then I can drag left or right with the middle mouse, and I can basically make the size of my brush bigger or smaller. If you double click on the tool though, you can have those same options. Let me double click in, there we go, in the tool settings here. So here's the size and then here's the strength. So if you hold the M key, I'm not going to do it, but if you hold the M key and middle mouse drag left or right, you also can change the strength on the fly. I like the strength that I have set up in here. So again, I'm just going to hold the B key and make my brush a little bit smaller. Basically, as I drag across here, I can start to sculpt and add detail. Now, if I want to carve out an area, I can hold the Control key and drag and carve into this image. And if I want to smooth it, looks like I accidentally moved it just slightly. Maybe I didn't. I think I just grabbed the wrong tool here. If I hold the Shift key, I can smooth out the area. So let me make my brush a little bit bigger here. Let's see. And just kind of drag across here. Maybe a little too big. Kind of sculpt, sculpt, sculpt. And then again, if I hold Control, I can carve in. You can see how I'm carving that in that area. And I'm going to undo this stuff because Maya is okay for this work. And if this is all you have, you can basically keep working on this in here, and it's totally fine. There's no issues here at all with working this way. Looks like I moved the horse accidentally, so I'm going to go back to my top view, click on this guy, and with the Move tool, and let's see. And then again, just hold X and kind of snap to the middle here. So what we're going to do here is we're going to bring it into another application called Mudbox, which is really designed for sculpting. So again, if all you have is Maya, you can continue to sculpt. You can play around with different sculpt tools. Basically, the way I work though is just with that sculpt tool, just basically holding Shift to smooth, Control to carve, and basically just adjusting the pressure to keep adding geometry on there. But a better way to do this is to bring it into a program called Mudbox. So There's a couple things we have to do first. We have to make sure this is centered on the grid. The other thing we have to do is we have to give it UVs. So if I go to UV here and open up the UV editor, these are the default UVs, and they're not great. You can see it's kind of a mess. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go to the Create UV set and choose Automatic here. And that lays out a nice UV set that's good enough to bring in a Mudbox. Then I can click out and select the object, again in my modeling toolkit in object mode. And you just want to make sure your history is deleted and your pivot centered. So I have that all set up in my custom shelves. I have history deleted, freeze transformation, and center pivot. That's all really important. And then there's a hotkey kind of set up under the file menu. You can click on send to Mudbox, and you can save it as a new scene, and it will update and bring it into Mudbox, which is really cool. And so here's Mudbox, and Mudbox is really awesome sculpting program. And it did have a little bit of sculpt there from Maya, but it's okay. But if I hit the W key, you can see the level of detail we have here. And I'm going to click on the Layers tab up here. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new layer. And I did this last time before. Click on the Sculpt tab, and then click on the new Layer tab, which is this guy here. And that will add a new layer. And kind of think of layers kind of like in Photoshop. So whatever I sculpt on here, I can basically move into another program, another layer, and keep adding to it, and I can always modify it. So the one tool I'm going to use first is this grab tool, which is the fourth one in. And I have the mirror set up with the x-axis. As long as you set that up ahead of time, you're good, as long as everything's centered here. And then to change my size of my brush here, I'm on a Cintiq, so I can just use my little scroller here. But you can adjust the size over here and the strength. And so what I want to do is make my brush kind of big, and I'm going to kind of pull in the geometry on each side. See how it sort of tapers in this little part here? I want it to taper in a little bit. And then you can also pull out. So I'm going to pull out geometry just by grabbing to kind of make this a little bit thicker on the edges here. I'm just going around and thickening that up. And then I'm going to do that. I'm going to shrink down the brush a little bit, but I'm going to pull out a little bit. I want the cheeks to kind of pull out a little bit like that. And this is good to do it at this lower subdivision, any kind of moving tools kind of thing. But if I'm going to basically do more to this, what I would want to do is add a new layer here and subdivide this. So I'm going to hit Shift D to subdivide, and it will go to 35,000 polygons here. So it's basically doubling each time you hit Shift D. And so now it's a greater detail, and I can go to my Sculpt tool here, which is the far left tool here. And my strength's really low, so it's 0.01. The strength by default I think is set to 15, which is kind of crazy. But now I can come in here and shrink down my brush a little bit. And I have this stamp selected in here. I've clicked in here, the stamp. If I click on stamps, it's this little square stamp here at the bottom. And then in the stencil area here, or not stencil, but the fall off, I chose the stamp as the fall off, this sort of square. And so what that'll do is it'll give you this feeling of like real clay sculpture. And so you can see here as I drag across here, and I'm going to hit W to get rid of the grid line. You can start to see it's kind of building up, just like clay build up. And it's doing on both sides again because I use the X key to add geometry. But look how cool that is. And now if I hold Shift, I can smooth out geometry. And then if I hold Control, make my brush a little smaller, hold Control, I can carve away. So the same hotkeys are both in Maya and Mudbox for the Sculpt tools, which is really cool. So if you know one, you kind of know the other. But now what I could do is in this area approximately, I think it was like right here, I could carve out where the eye socket would be, essentially by holding the Control key. But to be more precise, what I could do is go back to Maya and bring in that eyeball, which is kind of cool. So this time I will select the eyeball, and I have to unreference it and then select it. And then I'm going to go ahead and delete the history, freeze transformation, center pivot, and then go File, and then go to send to Mudbox. And instead of send a new scene, I'm going to update current scene. And it's giving me this issue. It's because it has a pole, vertex pole, and you just basically just say keep this mesh, because I'm not really going to sculpt this eye. I'm just kind of using it as a reference in here. And so now what I can do is go to my object list here, and there's a little lock symbol you can click on right between the two sort of icon for the layer. So now that eyeball's kind of locked, and I just click out, go back to my layers, and now when I sculpt back on here, you'll see the sculpt layer returns. But now I can actually sculpt around here and kind of build a frame for this eye socket, very quick and easy. So you can see how this is a superior program for digital sculpting. This can handle millions of poly versus maybe hundreds of thousands in Maya. You really don't want to have that much poly in Maya. It's going to tax your application quite a bit. But Mudbox are designed for this digital sculpting. Now we're not going to be able to bring this mesh back into Mudbox. What we're going to have to do is create a texture map, and that texture map will basically we'll be able to overwrite the geometry and give the look and feel of the sculpt once it's done. You can start to see here as I carve, I'm starting to build up some geometry. It's great to sort of slowly build this up little by little, and look at some references of horses. I'm going to look at some references as I sculpt on here. But if I ever want to go up and down in subdivisions, there's this thing called page up, page down. So if I hit the page down, I can go down to my lower level layer here, and this is where I would do again those big moves with the grab tool. And so and then if I hit page up, I go back up to the highest level, which is at 35,000 poly, which is still relatively low, and then click on the next layer. So what you want to do is build up like level of planes, forms, simple forms, little by little in the sculpting program, and then add another layer for each one. The nice thing about the layers is if we turn them off, you can see the original sculpt is basically the same here. We'll have to bake down these layers eventually with the final sculpt, but I can show you that process later on. So this pretty much covers it for little introduction to sculpting. Again, you can download Autodesk Mudbox for free as a student or educator, just like Maya. So if you really dig this application, it is a lot of fun and it is very powerful for sculpting. But if you don't want to do that, you can always go back to Maya and give it a try with the sculpt, or again, just work with that the more rigid way of dealing with the night, which is a more geometric way like this one here, which we did in the tutorial before. So until next time, see you soon in Autodesk Maya and Mudbox. Cheers!